Hey everyone, James Niggemeyer here. Thank you for tuning back into my YouTube channel. It's Tuesday, so it's time for another Two Bait Tuesday. And this is kind of a series that I started a couple weeks ago, missed a couple weeks, but I'm back at it. Here we are, Two Bait Tuesday. The premise of this video is just to share two baits that I really feel like for this period, this time of year, specifically more where I am located, but it'll kind of ripple effect throughout the country as things warm up. But for here in Texas, in kind of this longitudinal line all across Alabama, Mississippi, Carolinas, Georgia, and in through Florida, there's a couple baits, and maybe even Tennessee and Arkansas and Oklahoma, just depending upon where it is and what the water temperature's like. Basically, the water temperature around here is ranging from the high 50s to the low 60s, depending upon the day. We have a cold wind, it's gonna kind of knock it back a little bit. So much of what we do this time of year, this spring time of year, here we are in March 23rd, and there's so much of that is predicated by, is there cloud cover, is there wind, is there the lack of wind, is the sun out, just different things like that that are gonna make the water temperature elevate and some days make the fish more aggressive. So in trying to play both sides of the game, and what I mean by that is kind of have something if the fish get aggressive and then something if they're not so aggressive. This is kind of that period where, at least in my part of the country, there's some fish on beds, a small portion are on beds, and there's a lot that are kind of pre-spawn, moving or thinking about getting ready to spawn. They're elevated in the water column, maybe not so much thinking about feeding. It can be kind of a tough time of year. But there's a couple baits that I want to share with you guys that are kind of a little bit outside the box. One of them is anyways, and you just don't hear a lot of guys talk about it. But the premise of this video is to share two baits. One that's kind of more of a winding type bait, a power type bait, power fishing type bait, and then one that's more of a soft plastic, slow type finesse. So if you have aggressive fish, you've got one, and then if they're not aggressive, you got another. So with that, let's get into it. If the fish are aggressive or if they're willing to chase, this time of year, it's really hard to beat a swim jig. Just a black and blue swim jig will be great on your overcast days, and your dark days, and rainy days, and in off-colored water. And then if I'm fishing, say, more in your clear water that maybe is less stained, maybe visibility is more like around 1.5 to 2 feet zone, then I'm gonna think more along the lines of like a green pumpkin or a bluegill color. This one's a Strike King KVD heavy cover. I like the heavy cover swim jig just because it has a little bit heavier hook and it'll hold, I think, big fish better. If I'm fishing for smaller fish, just their standard KVDs, a Strike King KVD swim jig will work just as well. I've kind of thinned out the weed guard. I kind of just cut it at that sort of an angle, level angle. I've got a Strike King Rage Tail Menace grub on the back. There's a few different grub trailers that you can use, a Rage Craw with the double tail craw type tail, and then the Menace grub, which is also more of a subdued double tail. And then the Swimmin' Caffeine Shad is a great one, which is kind of just a boot style trailer. I've got this tied on a 7/6 medium heavy lose rod, and it's a fast action. So it's actually a moderate fast action. And I've got it on 30-pound test braided line. I like 30-pound test braided lines, the Strike King tour grade braid, to like a 16 to 20-pound test fluorocarbon leader. I use that Gamma fluorocarbon leader. And I like that, so if I slow it down, or if the water's clear, I can slow it down and not be too concerned about the fact that your line is more opaque with braided line. I can kind of straddle the fence. I get all the wonderful things that you get with braided line, less stretch and so forth, but you have the invisibility of fluorocarbon. And it kind of gives me a little bit of a shock absorber if one eats it right quick and I hit him pretty hard. Just a bit of stretch that the braid doesn't have, and this hook probably enables you so it doesn't flex out so much. Even though it is a heavy cover, you hit one at point blank with a heavier rod and it could be it could end up not going well for you. I've got it all tied up to a Lose Hyper Mag, and this is an 8:3-to-1 gear ratio. I like that faster gear ratio. Sometimes the swim jig, you're fishing real shallow, a fish comes up and gets it, and you lean into him, he'll swim right at you. That faster gear ratio helps me pick it up. And with a swim jig, I kind of fish it just like a spinnerbait with no blades. And that leads me to another part. There's so many different great fast-moving baits that you could fish this time of year, or baits that really cover water well this time of year. But I chose the swim jig because probably my number one would probably be a spinnerbait. But there are days when it's flat, clear, and calm, and there's not much of a ripple of wind on the surface, and you don't just get as many bites unless the water's more off color. Sometimes even a white swim jig would work well. A square bill could also be a great alternative, but I sat with the swim jig. Seems like this time of year you swim these through an area where fish are a little bit more protective. They become a little bit territorial as the spawn gets close, and the swim jig works really well. My other one is a floating worm. More of my finesse type scenarios, a floating worm. Now this really isn't a floating worm. It doesn't really float per se. This is a striking Kvd Finesse Worm, and it's a 6.5 inch in methylate. You could use methylate, you could use bubble gum, you could use white, yellow. There's so many different what we would call floating worms. They're basically just finesse worms in a kind of a bright color. Something about those bright colors when those fish get around beds or start to think about beds that really elicit strikes. And this is a technique that was popularized years and years ago, and is kind of fallen out of favor, but it's starting to come back around. People are starting to throw it more, and I'm kind of bummed about that. But since people are starting to talk about it, I might as well talk about it myself. And so it is a 6.5 inch KVD Strike King KVD Finesse Worm out of their Perfect Plastics line. I'm putting that on a 4/0 owner offset wide gap. It's cutting point. A little bit more weight to that hook. So in that, because I'm throwing it on a heavier gauge hook, throwing it on a bait caster. Floating worm you could throw with spinning gear, and then I would kind of maybe back off and just maybe use an owner all-purpose hook instead of the owner offset wide gap. The owner offset wide gap is a XXX strong, so it's a heavier gauge hook. But when you're around some really big ones, I kind of like using bait casting equipment. I like using bait casting equipment all the time. I believe I've got 14-pound test gamma fluorocarbon. And then here's the key: bigger, like a size 7 or maybe a size 5 barrel swivel. Adds a little bit more weight, helps you throw it, gets rid of the twist in your line, and additionally, it helps the bait sink. This bait just wouldn't sink as well or throw as well without that barrel swivel, a larger barrel swivel like that. Just throw it out into your likey looking pockets, let it kind of sink, and then I just twitch. And you kind of want to be able to see it. A lot of times you'll be able to see the strikes. Sometimes you twitch, and just let it fall out of sight, and your line will tighten up. It's a slower, more finesse type technique, but you're actually able to cover water with it. So you can do something here that you can't really do with a lot of different slow-moving soft baits or finesse type techniques. So this is a great way to catch them. It's kind of reminiscent of the old twitch baits that we use, like sluggo type baits. And this bait just catches them, especially around the spawn or when they're getting ready to spawn, moving in, getting a little bit more territorial. What else can I tell you? 14-pound test fluorocarbon, gamma fluorocarbon leader. Sometimes if I'm throwing it on spinning, I'll throw it with like 15-pound test Strike King Tour Grade braid, and then I'll go with like a 12 or I'm probably more like a 14 to 16-pound test gamma fluorocarbon leader, and that way there's you can set the hook on the end of a long cast with that spinning gear. I've got this on a Lose Magnum Bass Rod 2, which is a 7.2 medium heavy fast action rod. And then again, I'm kind of gone to the point where I'm Lose Hyper Mag almost across the board, either that or the Pro TI. Those are my two favorite Lose reels. And then I've got this on a 7.5-to-1 gear ratio reel. Really don't need a super fast gear ratio reel for these. But that's my two bait Tuesday. These are the two baits that I think, man, just really work well at getting bit this time of year. Because a lot of those fish are really starting to push shallow. Again, that water temperature is in the mid 50s to low 60s, and depending upon the weather, they may really get aggressive or they may get unaggressive. And I've even just fished these. I'll just throw it out there, twitch it, and just let it fall all the way to the bottom, or almost all the way to the bottom, then twitch it again. Just if you feel like it's harder to get bites, slow it down. Feel like it's easier to get bites, speed it up. Sometimes you can see them eat it like a spinnerbait coming across the water. The swim jig, again, fishing it like a spinnerbait without blades. But there's my 2-Bait Tuesday. Looking forward to a great spring. Hope you guys are too. Give these baits a try when you're out there on the water. Hopefully you catch a new personal best. Thanks for tuning into my YouTube channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and like this video if you do like the content I'm presenting here to you. And until next time, thanks for watching and good fishing.